Hello again, Rick. This is part two of the discussion we're having, and we really wanted to talk to you about coercive control and the work you've been doing looking at that. Could you tell us what your interest has been in that and what you found?
Yeah, well, my interest is really the stark contrast between what one finds in the criminal justice statistics on coercive control and what seems to come out of the research literature, or at least some of the research literature, and the evidence from Both Parents Matter, the charity that I'm trustee of. So, the place to start, I suppose, is, I think it was 2015, when coercive control, or properly, let's get the full title of this offence right, coercive and controlling behaviour in an intimate or family relationship. That became a criminal offence by being incorporated into the Serious Crime Act 2015, Section 76, in 2015. I think it was the beginning of January that year. It's quite noteworthy that that's the case, because most domestic abuse is not specifically a criminal offence, I think I'm right in saying. They just, domestic abuse offences tend to be instances of other more general offences that are already in the statute book, but the coercive control is a specific offence. The issue for me is no one really knows exactly what it is, and it covers a huge spectrum of behaviours. And I think that's what's leading to this mismatch that I referred to. Let's start, I think, with the criminal justice stats, and then I'll go back to talk about our charities results in this area, and then talk about the research literature. So this is the data on prosecutions and convictions for engaging in controlling or coercive behaviour in an intimate family relationship for the year ending December 2019. The number of proceedings against men, 555. The number of proceedings against women, 19. The number of convictions of men, 301. The number of convictions of women, 4. Sentenced to immediate custody, 193 men and 3 women. So those are the criminal justice statistics. And from that, it would be quite reasonable to draw the conclusion that this is a behaviour which is almost entirely male perpetrators and female victims. So that's what the criminal justice stats say. The trouble is, there is a mismatch between that and other information coming out of research. So let's start with BPM service users. In part one of this video, this interview, I alluded to the risk indicator checklist that we take our predominantly male service users through. And with the exception of the question which is about child contact, which is inevitably very high, the one that got the highest score from our service users was, does the abuser try to control everything you do, and or are they excessively jealous? For which 88% said yes. And that includes many men who didn't consider themselves victims of domestic abuse. Now, the question here is, what exactly is coercive and controlling behaviour? Clearly that question relates to it. But there are potentially other questions in there that relate to coercive and controlling behaviour. So definitely one of them is question 4, which is, do you feel isolated from family and friends? 68% said yes. So there's an indication there, albeit not at a level of criminality. But there's an indication there that this sort of behaviour is something that men commonly experience. So, as I say, not necessarily at a level of criminal offence, but
The
it's not.
implication being that the controlling partner is stopping them from having relationships with family and friends. Is that the link that you're making?
Well, that and the direct answer to does the abuser try to control everything you do, which is
Yeah.
the other one. Those are the two questions. So let's go now to some other research literature. Now, where do I best start here? Let's start with the ONS, the Office for National Statistics. And let's start firstly with what we know as the CSEW, the Crime Survey for England and Wales. This is the survey that's done annually that covers all sorts of crimes, and it is generally regarded as the best indicator of the prevalence of crime, better than police statistics, for example. It's based on survey. And it asks questions about domestic abuse, generally, and it does not just ask questions about physical domestic abuse or sexual abuse. It also asks non-physical questions about abuse. And I have the questions here, unless these have changed in the last year or two. So these are the questions that they ask in that survey. Have you been isolated from relatives and friends? Are you being humiliated or belittled by the abuser? Is your control or access to household money is being controlled by your abuser, or how much you spend being controlled? Are your letters, emails, and texts monitored? And does the abuser keep track of everywhere you go? Those are the questions that they ask. So if you look at the CSEW responses, and this is published every year, famously, the CSEW across the entire range of different domestic abuse categories comes up with 1 in 3 victims are men. So 1 in 3 victims are men, 2 in 3 victims are women. That's across all the types of abusive behaviour. But they also publish the results for these non-physical types of abuse, as well as physical and sexual. So you can look this up. And it doesn't differ that much. It may be slightly less than 1 in 3 for the non-physical abuse, but that's only because the physical abuse is actually rather more than 1 in 3, and it averages out 1 in 3. But it's not very different in terms of proportion. So the implication of that, to me, is that the CSEW, the Crime Survey for England and Wales, is indicating a high prevalence of those non-physical abusive behaviours. However, the question arises as to whether those questions correctly measure coercive control, because those questions were devised many years before coercive and controlling behaviour became a crime. And this has been challenged, not least by people in the women's sector, the women's domestic abuse sector. So in, I think it was April 2019, the ONS published the results of some research, some extra research they carried out in the previous couple of years, exploring the use of different questions that were designed more to be targeted at what people regarded as coercive and controlling behaviour. And to advise them, they had an advisory panel which consisted of what I would call the usual culprits. So in other words, it was people taken to be expert on domestic abuse, which sounds reasonable, except that they will invariably be from the feminist sector of domestic abuse. So those people who I would regard as neutral researchers were notable for not being there. But anyway, they came up with some questions to advise the ONS to use. I won't list them all, I don't think I've got them to hand anyway, but basically they were questions which they thought were more indicative of coercive and controlling behaviour. And the subtext here, well, it's not a subtext, it's made explicit in the ONS's report, that the expectation was that if coercive controlling behaviour was measured properly, then what you would find is that it isn't 1 in 3 victims are men. Actually, it's the overwhelming majority of victims are women, and the overwhelming majority of perpetrators are men. It isn't 1 in 3 at all. That was the contention. And that was actually stated in the ONS's report on this in 2019.
So what were they were leaving out some of these as being examples of coercive control, were they? Some of
They weren't so much leaving them out as adding extra ones. And I regret now you've asked me the question, and I should have had them to hand, but I can fish them out and give you them. But actually, there were 2 sets of questions, because well, first of all, the methodology they used the same approach they use in the annual CSEW, the annual survey, but they split their sample of people into 2 halves in the best traditional of having a control. So one, the control sample, they asked the usual set of questions, and the other half, they asked this modified set of questions so they could compare the 2. And they actually had 2 new sets of questions, one which was about coercive and controlling behaviours, and the other which was about the potential impacts of those behaviours. So they got results for both of those. And let me tell you first what they did not include in those questions. Fear over contact with children was not included in the questions related to controlling behaviour. They did include a question on that in the impact questions, but not in the behavioural questions. And the other thing is that neither false allegations nor the fear of potential false allegations were included in either set of questions. So that's noteworthy because they are, of course, the 2 areas where you might expect there to be more men reporting in those categories, but they were not included. Despite that, let me give you the punchline in terms of the results. Despite that, the results were, quote, well, no, this isn't a quote, this is my summary. This is my summary of what is in the data tables that were reported by the ONS. And remember, they were comparing the old set of questions, which was for non-physical abuse, with the trial set of questions, which were targeted by experts at coercive and controlling behaviour.
And just tell us who's asking the questions of which groups of people. Is this with the Women's Aid Charity, for example, asking women, or is it other charities or other organizations?
No. Sorry, I should have said this is using the same methodology as this CSEW, which is a cross-section of the general public. It's roughly half and half men and women. I have no doubts that's chosen in, the ONS is full of statisticians, and I've no doubt it's chosen in a statistically good way, which is representative of the population at large. So it is a valid cross-section of the public chosen at random. Yeah. And roughly equal men and women. But the results were the trial controlling and coercive behaviour questions indicated significantly lower prevalence than the existing non-physical abuse questions, which I don't think is what they were expecting. I don't think it's what the advisory panel was expecting. But even worse, the sex difference in partner victimization prevalence rates was found to be substantially reduced by the trial controlling and coercive behaviour measure compared with the normal set of questions.
And
now remember, the expectation is the sex difference would be far bigger when they asked genuine coercive controlling behaviour, and in fact they found the opposite.
And this is without the question about, are you fearful of false allegations or losing contact with your children. That's without those questions. Yeah.
How much? Sorry, but how much do we know about the impact of these efforts? The impact on the way in which the police deal with things and the Crown Prosecution Service deals with things. Do we have any understanding of that?
Since we're talking about criminal justice, let's talk about the harm report that the Ministry of Justice commissioned last year and was published in June last year. And I know you've talked to Terry White about this, so you've had some introduction to it. And one of the documents that was produced under that was the literature review, authored by Dr. Adrienne Barnett. So as part of the literature review, Adrienne Barnett picked up this ONS research that I've just alluded to, and the results of which I've just given you. And this is how she reported it. Okay. She had a preamble in which she reiterated what I said was the advisory panel's view prior to the research being done, that they expected a proper measure of coercive control would show a much bigger sex difference than the 1 in 3. And that was, I think, the reason why they were interested in doing it. And Adrienne Barnett quoted from the ONS research report as follows. And let me emphasize, this is an accurate verbatim quote. She quoted it as follows. And this is all she quoted from it. Research suggests that when coercive and controlling behavior is taken into account, the differences between the experiences of male and female victims becomes more apparent. And then she gives a reference to ONS. Now that is extracted from that report. And if that's all you read in the literature review, what impression does that give you? It gives you the impression.
Yeah, go on. Is there anything about that which is true? It sounds like it's just not true.
Well, it says, let me read it again. Research suggests that when coercive and controlling behavior is taken into account, the differences between the experiences of male and female victims becomes more apparent. In other words, they're saying that when you measure coercive controlling behavior properly, you'll get a much bigger difference than the 1 in 3, and it will be overwhelmingly female victims. That's what apparently is asserted. And this is the only thing she quotes from that ONS research, thereby clearly giving the reader of that literature review the impression that the ONS research supported that contention. And as you know, because I've given you the results of the research, it didn't. And the point is that it's a classic case of taking a quote out of context, because that quote, that verbatim quote from the ONS, was in the context in their report of being the expectation of their advisory panel before the research was carried out. Later in the report, it says this. Some of the groups suggested that the sex difference would be larger for controlling or coercive behavior than for non-physical abuse. Our findings are not consistent with this expectation.
But I suppose when she says the experiences are different, then presumably that may be true, that men and women experience different kinds of coercive control. It doesn't mean that the severity or the frequency is any different, but the type of experience may be different. That's how you could interpret her sentence in a positive way?
Yeah, maybe that's true, but I would humbly submit that if that's the only quote you use from that ONS report, you are giving the reader entirely the opposite impression. I mean, how much clearer can it be than the actual conclusion that the ONS write, our findings are not consistent with this expectation, which she omitted to write. It's outrageous. I mean, it's what I call constructive mendacity, which is you can't actually say she lied because the only quote she's put in there is a verbatim quote from the report. So in a court of law, you'd lose your libel case. But it's clearly, deliberately and cunningly giving the reader the opposite impression of what that research showed.
It's being economical with truth, not sharing the full truth.
Absolutely, yeah, very much so. I mean, if you're a neutral researcher being paid by the MOJ to advise them on what the research literature says, is that what you'd write? No. So there has recently, just in the last couple of weeks, let me stick with that ONS report, the 2019 research report, because there's another bit there that's quite interesting. In relation to, you'll recall that in terms of impact, they did include the question, fear that you would lose contact with the children. Didn't include it in the behavioural questions, but they did include it in the impact question. And of course, as you would expect, more men than women reported positively on that they did fear that. It was, in fact, the only impact category in which more men than women suffered. And this is what the ONS write, clearly under the influence of their own advisory panel. There was concern amongst some members of the Domestic Abuse Statistics Steering Group that this impact was likely to elicit a relatively high response amongst men, which may not truly reflect controlling or coercive behaviour, but rather a relatively common outcome in dissolved relationships. As such, at this early stage of the research, we took the decision not to include this impact in the definition of a victim. Now, that's just mind-blowing to me. What they're saying is this is a question in which more men indicate victimization. So we'll rule it out of court as an indicator of coercive control. I mean, how much plainer does it have to be? The definition is being massaged in one direction. It's not in a neutral manner at all.
Is there a good reason why any of this needs to be gendered? Why? I mean, I understand that if you want to campaign for something, it's easier to make it, to create a kind of ideological basis for your campaign. But if you're seeking the truth about what's happening to individuals, there's a powerful argument for saying it's not about separating people by gender. It's about separating people by their experience, the severity of it, the nature of it, the context of it. It doesn't need to be gendered, does it? This is an absurd way of trying to work out what the truth is.
And that would be the ideal, but that's not what we've actually got here. And unfortunately, it's not the way things work out, even when generally speaking, the letter of the law is gender neutral. There are only a few laws, like laws about rape and so on, that might be explicitly gendered. Generally, the primary legislation is written in a gender neutral way, but unfortunately, it doesn't mean it gets interpreted in a gender neutral way. And I think we have an example of that in those prosecution and conviction statistics for coercive and controlling behaviour that I read out at the start. It's not really lobby groups and the family courts that are the primary problem for me. It's an endemic prejudice in society. I use the word prejudice there, and perhaps people won't like that word. It's that the old gendered mindset is still operative in all of us. And that means women need protection and men need controlling so that they don't harm women. And it all comes back to that. really. And men don't need protecting. They can look after themselves. So you have this skew in perception. And yes, there are lobby groups that are biased and will drive things in that direction out of their own ideological conviction. But their seed is falling on fertile ground, if I can put it that way, because we're all inclined to be that way.
Yeah.
So that's the issue. I mean, but I entirely agree with you. The gender neutral approach should be the way to go. You should be judged on what you have done, not what you are. That
Well, we're
is
seeing a
without.
lot of examples where people are being judged on what they are, and it goes beyond the family court or coercive control, because, well, I suppose it's part of coercive control, because we've also got the appalling history of exploitation of girls, children,
Yes,
in
children.
towns all around the UK by gangs of men who've controlled them, raped them, exploited them, and concerned that there have been ideological reasons or fears of ideological pushback, racist pushback, etc., that stop people from protecting these children. And there seems to be a widespread pattern of people choosing a kind of ideological position or a political position rather than approaching the problem on the basis of what are the needs of the individual and how to meet them best.
Yes, and this would take its way beyond family courts, as you rightly say, and into the whole political arena of identity politics and critical race theory and wokeness and the whole caboodle. And I couldn't agree more that this is appalling. This is an appalling development. I mean, I unambiguously oppose it. As far as I'm concerned, it's a form of moral corruption. It's divisive at its core, and only bad can come of it.
Rick, we can
It's
only
staggering to me that we've gone down that we're continuing to go down this route, and unfortunately, it's because it's something to do with the educational system, primary, secondary, and tertiary, that is driving it, I think.
Well, wherever it's coming from, it's there, and I think that's probably a good note to finish on. Frankly, I don't think we can cap that.
But you,
Well, the one thing I haven't covered is the sort of wider research literature. Now, I just if we can have a couple of minutes more, there's a report just come out from the Home Office in the last couple of weeks, specifically about coercive control, and there's a collection of research evidence there. So I won't attempt to summarize it all, and the research does go in many different directions, so I won't pretend this is a fair cross-section, but let me give you a few quotes. Here's one. Hester et al. 2017 investigated the prevalence of coercive control among male victims. In a survey of 1,368 male patients in 17 GP surgeries in England, 51% reported experiencing potentially harmful behaviours, compared with 15%, and implicitly coercive controlling behaviours, compared with 15% for physical behaviours and 7% for sexual behaviours. Research by Bates et al. 2014 found that there were no substantial sex differences in controlling behaviour which significantly predicted physical aggression in both sexes. Bates and Graham Cavan, 2016, argue that their analysis showed that there were no sex differences in the use of controlling behaviour or physical aggression. So it's just reinforcing what I was suggesting, that actually you can argue about the details, but it isn't as gender skewed as you're seeing in the criminal justice statistics, and there's an issue there.
Yes, absolutely.
I don't know if this is at all interesting, Rick, but when I did a video, and it's going back, I think, a couple of years, on coercive control, I went to the Crown Prosecution Service website, and the guidance that I gave on the video was that to look through those examples of coercive control, and those were the things that they would be looking at. And I don't recall it being gendered at all in that, which, you know, that's a relief, I think. I'm going to go back this evening probably and have another look. But isn't it interesting how, even though it isn't gendered, it's the people, isn't it? Obviously. But
it's psychology. It's psychology that is driving this. There's no doubt that the letter of the law is gender neutral, but it's the way it's implemented, and it does go back to the old, you know, men are agentic, women are hypoagentic, and all that stuff. It plays out in the criminal courts in a big way.
Well, we're looking forward to talking to Deborah Powney about the alliance between Women's Aid, Respect and Refuge, who operate apparently, and I'm sure she'll tell us, and we're looking forward to hearing her research on this. They operate as a cartel, largely controlling the debate about domestic abuse and insert their influence in all these reviews.
But what they're doing is they're exploiting our natural tendency. It's easy for them to do it because they're exploiting our natural inclination. So they're going with the grain of human nature. Because Deborah Powney herself is a victim of truly egregious coercive controlling behavior. So just to be clear, I'm not some sort of coercive control denialist, quite the contrary. I absolutely recognize that nasty coercive control is real and very, very harmful, because people can be psychologically crushed to the point where they don't know which way is up, and they can no longer even frame their own abuse coherently because the whole perception is distorted. So it's a terrible thing when it happens. But the trouble is, where do you draw the line in coercive control? And this is why you can get all sorts of different results, because no one really knows how to measure it. There's a saying in physics that, you know, if you can't measure something, you don't know what it is. Well, you know, we all control all the time. I mean, I've been speaking to you today, and you could interpret that as control because I'm trying to convince you of my point of view. So
we do interpret that way, Rick.
It's my interpretation of things. That's a sort of control. And it's the control that we all have every time we interact with anyone. But that's the normal, accepted, benign social level of control. But then you can progress to a higher level where it becomes a real character flaw, where somebody is unpleasantly controlling all the time, and they're the sort of people you really think, oh, I don't like him, I'll avoid him. But it's not bad enough to be criminal. But then you get, you know, the really nasty stuff that you know, it's right that it should be criminalized. But how do you distinguish between cases when it's on this continuous spectrum of behaviors? And the danger is that, you know, you can drive the bar down to criminalize people who perhaps just have unpleasant personalities at one end, but then at the other end, based on sex, you know, other people may be getting away with things which are really nasty. It's a very difficult issue. Yeah.
Thank you, Rick.
Thank you. Yes,
I think we'll look forward to talking to you again about
that would be good.
All the other research and information you've got, because you've written books.
Well, I didn't plug my book the first time, did I? So this is under my pen name of William Collins. This is The Empathy Gap. There we are.
That's it.
Tremendous.
The Empathy Gap, William Collins.
Yeah.
And of course, I have a blog of the same, illustrated Empathy Gap, which is on empathygap.uk.
Good.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Will you talk to us again, please?
Yeah, by all means. Yeah, whatever you like. We can talk about quantum mechanics next time, if you like.
Probably easier to understand.
Thank you very much, Rick.